How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about autolysis with fat and why you should and shouldn't do it. Now here's a quick recap on how gluten works. In the simplest terms, flour contains two proteins that form gluten, called glutenin and gliadin. Although they are in the flour, they are kind of separated. It is when you add water to your flour that they connect and form gluten. So hydrating the flour and letting it absorb plenty of water will result in good gluten development. This is especially important in high hydration though, because there's too much water in relation to the flour. Now when we add fat to the flour, the proteins get coated. And the coating of fat inhibits the connection of the proteins and gluten formation. The addition of fat is basically the opposite of autolyzation. So let's do an experiment. So we're going to make two simple focaccias. 75% hydration, which is relatively high, and 15% fat, which will be oil in this case. And this could be also used for pizza dough or ciabatta, any kind of flatbread. So with the first dough, I'm going to do the Autolyse with most of the water, all of the flour, and then I'm going to add the fat and the salt and the yeast afterwards. The second dough will be slightly different. We're going to add the oil to the Autolyse. I've never done it this way, so I want to see the difference here. And as I mentioned earlier, the addition of fat is basically the opposite of autolyzation. And I would only use this method in certain applications. See, autolysis is most useful for high hydration lean dough, meaning high hydration dough with lots of water which does not contain fat. It is used by bakers to cut down mixing time when using a mixer. Because when you're trying to mix a high hydration dough straight from the get-go, it takes a long time. And the longer you mix your dough, the more it will oxidize. Oxidization will make the dough lose its color and flavor. Obviously, when kneading by hand, we don't have this problem. It is impossible to over-mix your dough. So when it comes to hand kneading, there's a different purpose. The dough becomes a lot easier to handle, and it also cuts down on mixing time, meaning that the dough won't warm up too much. Now let's get back to the fat. I'm currently mixing the second dough, in which I added the oil, the water, and the flour straight from the get-go. So on the right, we have the dough that only contains water and flour. On the left, we have the other dough with the addition of oil. I could already feel a big difference when mixing it. The second dough was a lot stickier. And as you can see, the first dough I can stretch out already. Come to pick up the second dough, it sticks to my hands, it tears very easily. So we can already see the issue here. Now I'm going to cover it up, leave it to hydrate, then we're going to go to knead the dough. So I'm going to let these sit for around an hour to give the second dough a fair chance. I mean, I already know what will happen. Obviously the first dough will be a lot easier to work with. There's no good reason to add fat to the dough straight from the get-go. So they've both been sitting for about an hour. As you can see, the first dough, I pick it up, it's nice and stretchy. Obviously, always remember to use wet hands when handling sticky dough. Picking up the second dough actually surprised me. It's also quite stretchy, but it definitely feels a lot stickier. So while we are kneading the first dough, we're going to put the second one aside. And I'll just continue on as normal. Always keep back a little bit of the water to hydrate the yeast in. And then, add your salt, add your oil, mix it all together, and knead it. I will knead both of these doughs for around 8 minutes to keep everything equal. So although the flour here is hydrated nicely, and the dough is nice and stretchy and glutinous, by adding the oil now and mashing it into the dough, we are undoing the process. The gluten will be broken up again. And while a dough like this with oil would take around 8 minutes to knead, without it, it may take 5 minutes. So I've got to tell you, there are better ways of adding fat to your high hydration dough. Normally, when I would make a pizza, focaccia, ciabatta, I would hydrate the flour with the water, then mix it with the salt and the yeast, knead it for however long it needs to, but I would not add the oil yet, because the oil can easily be added to the dough whilst folding during bulk fermentation. So why not do it that way then? Because we don't always fold the dough, right? Let's say we're doing a cold proof. You would mix your dough, would stick it in the fridge, and it would sit there overnight. There would be no folds, so you wouldn't have a chance to add your oil whilst folding. So I hope you see what we're getting at here. Autolysis with oil, with the addition of oil after autolysis, should be quite a rare occasion. And it should only be done due to necessity, really. If you have a choice, you should always fold your fat into the dough. So after 8 minutes of kneading, the first dough felt quite good. We got sufficient gluten development, it didn't warm up too much. Let's make the second one. And I would not advise using this method, ever. I can feel the dough being a lot looser and stickier. But we're going to give it the same treatment. Tip it out on the table and knead it for 8 minutes. But how would I add butter to my dough, I hear you ask? How would I fold in butter? Well, that would be difficult, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So this dough, I can feel it, it's a lot stickier. And the funny thing after autolyzation, when you mix it by hand, first it feels the dough is quite, cohesive. But then you go on first couple of minutes and just start disintegrating. But then of course you keep kneading, it starts coming back together again. And this one, being with the fat added from the get-go, feels really sticky. It's like mixing porridge. And kneading it for 8 minutes like the first one would not be sufficient. Of course you can knead it for longer and get the gluten development. But like I said, the dough will warm up. And we all know what happens when your dough is too warm, right? I mean, it depends on what bread you're making. This would be pretty good for this application. Like we're making a focaccia, it's gonna be flat, it's gonna spread out. It doesn't really matter that it's a bit sticky. If you're doing it at home, it should be perfectly fine. But if you were making a pizza or ciabatta, this would be very hard to handle. So now we can start fermenting the two and see what happens later. It's worth noting that every minute that your dough basically exists, it is kind of in the autolyzation process. Because just by sitting around, be it the first part of the mixing or final fermentation, it's still sitting there and the flour is hydrating. And of course there comes a point where it's fully hydrated. So the dough has been fermenting for a while, so I'm going to give it a fold, see how it is. As I mentioned earlier, this would be a great way to add your fat. But that's not the point of this experiment. The first dough is nice and strong. I can stretch it, I can do the coil fold, it doesn't stretch out too much, it's quite tight. The second dough is clearly a lot stretchier, as you can see. Which is not a bad thing, necessarily. Autolyzation aids in extensibility. So another benefit of it is that it helps with oven spring. I'm going to leave these for the second proof. After the second proof, we're going to place them on a tray and do the final proofing and then the baking. So let's address the question that everyone was really asking me. People are not talking about focaccias, ciabattas, pizzas. They're talking about enriched dough, as in burger buns, sweet rolls, cinnamon buns. And the fact is that you simply don't do autolyzation in dough like that. Breads like that don't benefit in any way from an autolyse step. The kneading time for a dough like that before the addition of fat is already short, so there's no point of hydrating the flour beforehand. And it won't benefit from the extra extensibility that the Autolyse adds. Because a dough that contains a lot of butter and eggs and sugar is already light and fluffy. It wouldn't need any extra help with rising in the oven. And I actually feel that it would be a lot harder to work in 30% of butter in a dough that's been Autolysed. It's probably a lot easier to do it in a dough that is a bit looser. So it is pointless really, and that's why you never see anyone do it. But let's get back to these for a second. The first dough is a lot firmer and it wants to stand up more vertically. The second one, it spreads out a lot more. And of course that's because we added the fat from the get-go. It's a lot looser. So we can leave them for the final proof, then bake them. And as they are rising now, we can see that the first one is rising more up, at least from my perspective, it's a lot more visible. And the second one's spreading out sideways. That also indicates that the first dough would be able to take more fermentation gases. It would be able to rise a lot more and have more bubbles inside it before starting to collapse back again. And it would not be spreading out and be easier to handle. So clearly, if you're gonna do Autolyse with oil, then the first method would be the best. You mix your dough, hydrate it, and only then add your fat. So whilst those two are baking, let's do one more experiment, just for a laugh, and see what will happen if we mix all the ingredients right from the get-go and we do no Autolyse at all. So I've got water, oil, yeast and salt. Now we're gonna add the flour and try and knead this dough. I'm not looking forward to this. So we're coating the flour, we're coating the proteins in fat straight away. And we're not letting it hydrate at all. We're just gonna mix it. What do you think what will happen? How long do you think it will take me to knead this dough? Remember, this contains exactly the same amount of ingredients as the other two. I can tell you, it's not great. Now we're about 4 minutes in, and this is like glue. I mean, this looks and feels absolutely pointless. But you know, that's why we do these experiments, see what will happen. Of course, if you mix a dough for long enough, it will come together eventually. And this one also did, after 16 minutes. Yeah, it took exactly twice as long as the other one. We got there at the end, but you know, after 16 minutes of kneading by hand, or with a mixer for that matter, the dough would be way too warm. So you know, I do the experiments so you don't have to. So as you can see, adding fat to a dough straight away is not very good. Adding fat to an Autolyse is also not great, but you do it from time to time because you have to. So what's the conclusion here? Well, the Autolyse step is mostly useful for high hydration lean dough. Low hydration breads don't really benefit from it. So your burger buns and cinnamon rolls, they don't benefit from an Autolyse at all. If you do need to add oil to your high hydration dough, then fold it in if possible. If not, then use the first method that we showed here today. Make your Autolyse and work the fat in afterwards. So it's obvious that there's only very specific cases when you would Autolyse with fat, or you would add fat after the Autolyse, which is when you have a high hydration dough, which requires the addition of fat, but you can't fold it. Let's say you're cold proofing it. And that would be the only time really that you should be doing this. And to everyone who was asking me about Autolyse with fat for sweet buns and things like that, let me know down in comments why you think that is useful. I may as well be missing something. Of course, I don't know everything. And as I make these videos, I also learn a lot. So as always, any questions or suggestions, drop them down in comments. Don't forget to subscribe and click that bell to get notified of my next video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.